Welcome to Conversations in Mind. This is a space for conscious inquiry, where metaphysics, new thought, and the science of mind meet real life. In a world calling for deeper awareness, we explore the nature of consciousness, the power of thought, and the presence of spirit moving through everyday experience. And now, here are your hosts, Barb Bue and Mark Gilbert.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Conversations in Mind. We're so happy that you decided to come and play with us today in the land of thought. Our question that we ask every week is, what if your mind is more than a collection of thoughts? And what if it's a gateway to a completely new way of living? I'm Reverend Barbara. I'm joined by my friend and fellow minister, Reverend Mark Gilbert. And we're here to try to demystify the study of new thought and dive into the science and soul of consciousness itself. So whether you're a longtime seeker, you're curious about the power of your own perspective, we'll get into the mind and we'll get into consciousness and we'll get into some kind of conversation about all these things. But today, it's a little bit special because we had some comments and questions from a listener who wanted us to take on the question, is new thought a religion, and how is it evolving, if it is evolving? And that seemed like a really fun topic. So we're going to do that today. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Barb. It's great to be back with you. And as always, these are fun conversations. And, I think this is a nice time to remind everybody that if you have something you'd like us to talk about, we always mention this, but wherever you're watching this or listening to it, be sure to share a comment to us. I think that we get a lot of comments, especially from the New Thought Media Network's YouTube page, but wherever these podcasts and videos are going out, just put some comments in there. And Barb and I do try to monitor those and respond when we can, and also want your feedback and your questions. And I know that the reader or viewer, Rick, actually, they were raising this question in the context of the assumption that new thought is a religion that perhaps is evolving, and what were our thoughts around that? And I think the listener had actually read Ken Wilber's book, The Future of Religion. And I've read the book. I know Barb perhaps hasn't, but the gist of it, and we're not really here to talk about Wilber's book so much, but it's essentially that all the religions that we have are evolving. And that all religions have a process of change because they're human institutions that are moving through our human experience. And hence, since humanity is evolving, religions evolve along with humanity in a co-creative process. And so what are our thoughts regarding that in relative to new thought? And so is new thought, and so we sort of distilled that comment or question into the questions that Barb mentioned, which we'll start with, which is new thought a religion? And no matter how we answer that question in our own thoughts, it doesn't preclude the fact that whether it's a religion or a spirituality or however we want to label it, is it evolving? Is it changing? And if so, how are we doing that? So that's the direction we're sort of going. And Barb, why don't you kick us off on the first question?
Yeah, thank you. I want to say, I think that the question of whether it's a religion is an interesting one, but whether it is evolving is a much more interesting one. So starting with, is it a religion? And I guess that would depend on how you decide to define a religion. I think if you look at new thought, and I'll lump us all together for this part of this answer, I actually believe that this question is different for unity than it is for science and for Centers for Spiritual Living, because we're just on different paths, and for divine science even. So if I look at that, or if you look at the structure that we are familiar with in the United States and European countries in terms of the style of a religious service, then people would lump us as a religion, because we, as I often say, it's one of my soapboxes, that we took this beautiful teaching and we lumped it on top of a Christian service and the order of service and the way of being in that. So in that sense, yes. Also, to me, in the sense that there are a set of principles, practices, and beliefs that we align with within our traditions, which are different for Unity and for Science of Mind, Centers for Spiritual Living. They're similar, but different, significantly different, actually. Then I would say yes also to that, in terms of, if that's how you define a religion. Is there a set of principles, practices, beliefs? And then you get into the flexibility of those beliefs within our movement, which is, I think, more the question about the evolution. But do you want to take on the religion part at all first, or is it all together for you?
I'll add a few comments in here, and essentially I agree with everything that you were saying. I was sort of visualizing it like a Venn diagram. You've got something we might call spirituality and something we've got called religion over here, and that for the most part they overlap. But we do make some distinctions, but generally in modern culture, that when we talk about religion, we usually add in, but it has more structure, more dogma, more rules. It has taken itself into definitions, and usually the structure has led to some sort of formal ecclesiastical body who makes formal decisions regarding any modifications to the philosophy that they teach. So to the sense that there is a structure to, say, Christianity or Islam or Buddhism, it's usually because somewhere within the bailiwick of that particular faith, there's some entity who's putting down the rules regarding it. And I think the typical example would be, the Catholic Church, for example, is sort of the prototypical kind of dogmatic organization. We could also point at many other Christian religions here in the U.S. that do the same. But even within the bailiwick of Christianity as a religion, there's different flavors of Christianity. Much like if we were to take a circle of new thought, and you've already sort of outlined it, Unity, Divine Science, and Science of Mind / Centers for Spiritual Living, they as well as all the independent new thought centers, have their own. They also have their own flavors of new thought. So new thought's not necessarily a monolithic kind of thing in and of itself, but neither is Christianity. And and then even if you took Catholicism, even within that, there is flavors or a spectrum of belief within that. So it's kind of hard to pin down something as to one, direct entity. So on the one hand, there's the dogma, the rules, the structure, the ecclesiastical bodies, et cetera, like that. I think on the other end, when we talk about spirituality, I think that the common thinking is that it involves an experiential kind of nature, that spirituality is really about you as an individual being bouncing around and tasting spiritual teachings from the marketplace of spirituality and religion, and finding that aspect of it that works for your personal spiritual growth and personal evolution. And so everything I just said, it sort of falls into the center of the overlapping area between spirituality and religions. But there's little things on the edges where religion seems to be more dogmatic and rule driven and specific spiritual practices, et cetera. And spirituality seems to be more have an individual flavor, an individual push towards experiential stuff. But I think for the most part, they overlap a good bit.
They do. But what comes to mind while you're talking is that if you look at this idea of spiritual or spirituality, like there's some basic things that are pretty common to all of that in the New Thought realm: meditation, connection with God, source, spirit, whatever it is, and really kind of the seeking of that connection. And if you go back behind the major religions that you just talked about, and you go back to the practices of the mystics and the Kabbalah, and you go back to the Catholic mystics, and that was their thing too. And then all the structure got built.
Right.
And I would say that's partially true of, that's pretty much New Thought also. Like that a teaching comes forward in humanity, and it involves practices and this desire to connect. And then some structure gets built around it. And most of those structures become in some way about having rules and systems and a defined set of beliefs and and then the focus on growing that. And in early times, particularly like the beginnings of the Catholic Church, at the beginnings of Christianity, there was a lot of wanting to be in control of people.
Right.
And you can read the Bible from that aspect and see it through the whole thing. Or you can read it from, like, let's talk about the spiritual within it. So I think underneath we all had this spiritual basis, and then at some levels we all became religions, and some more than others.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think what happens is that the major religions have had a long time to evolve.
Yeah, we are new.
Humanity's evolution.
New thought is still new in that timeline perspective. New thought is still very new.
Right. I remember, I don't know if you remember, there was a guy in our ministerial class that we had back in 20-something years ago, Mark Merrill. I don't know if you had Mark as one of your instructors, but he came out of the Catholic. He was a Catholic teacher and not involved with New Thought other than teaching classes to New Thought ministers. But one of the interesting comments that he made in one of our classes that I had with him was that we were a new religion, a new philosophy, a new spirituality, that we hadn't had time to develop all of the structures and dogma and rules, including sort of an internal agreement about how we evolve and change. That there's no ecclesiastical body that sits out there and pontificates upon
like a council of bishops or anything. Yeah.
Yes. And, first off, if we were even to look at the different flavors of New Thought, of divine science and unity and science of mind, there's probably unity, as I think you were getting at that a moment ago, probably has a little more of a structure and formality regarding their philosophy and its tweaking of it, so to speak. Whereas, if we look at, certainly we come out of the science of mind world, and there is not that ecclesiastical body or group that says, well, science of mind is now going to take on this as how we are open at the top. This is the thing that we're going to do. And I think that part of that is really sort of driven by the fact that we are youthful in our evolution, that we haven't grown to that. But I'm not. But as I remember Mark talking about that years ago, I thought, but will we ever? And I hope that we don't. And there was sort of
and would the majority of our ministers sign in for that, right? Like,
because
we all want to think that we're super independent thinkers.
Yeah.
Even though mostly we're not. It's and I think unity, honestly, partially. Unity used to be called Unity School of Christianity. They are a more Christian belief system than we are in many ways. And so they actually kind of adopted that structure more easily than we would have adopted that structure.
Yes. But I know that you probably, like I do, hear things from our Unity brethren about changes and modifications.
They've had a huge thing recently because somebody wanted to go back to some original way of thinking, and other people want to be more like us, or more spiritual and less of the religious. And they've had a big giant to do. Call it a to do.
Back to the question then, is it a religion? I think that it gets to how you define it. I think I can see it as a very young religion, young faith, but I know that most folks within science of mind, at least it's my perception, that we consider it more a philosophy or a spirituality than a religion. I think that's what you'll find most people saying at this point in time.
Well, we had that slogan. I don't know where it came. I honestly don't know where it came from. I should look that up. But philosophy of faith, a way of life.
Right. It was the magazine's tagline for many years.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So, so I'm sitting here comparing, like, if we were talking to somebody from, say, a Baptist church right now, they would probably say they have a philosophy and a faith and a way of life,
Right.
We just think ours is more expansive.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times with science of mind and people who come into New Thought, they come out of a sense of growing out of or rebellion against more traditional faiths.
Yes.
And so there comes a natural tendency to want to push back against ecclesiastical structure that overlays a sense of dogma and what you're required to believe.
Yeah.
And so we're a bunch of it's the herding cats is the joke. We're a bunch of free thinkers who want to think for ourselves and be open at the top for myself, but
Yes.
not necessarily see how what I come up with is open at the top is not necessarily what you have to accept and believe. And so we have a degree of allowing freedom of thought and personal choice in spirituality that I think sometimes is not quite as open in many other more dogmatic religions.
We do though have some, I call them science of mind fundamentalists.
Oh yeah.
Totally. I mean, and interestingly, those people probably think they are more open / more spiritual, not religious than the rest of us.
Right.
Because they're pretty strict about, this thing called spiritual mind treatment works, and you heal
Right.
with it, and you demonstrate with that. And honestly, I have a lot of respect for that level of faith and the demonstration that comes from that. It doesn't always show up well in debate and conversation. But
Yeah. No, I remember, there's a lot of people who used to use the phrase, well, we've got to go back to principle, and that
Yes.
would be almost like the code words for
lock in.
Yeah. And
Ernest Holmes said this, and
Yes.
therefore, and I'm like, every time I've heard somebody go, Ernest Holmes said this, and therefore, that Ernest Holmes is like rolling his eyes up wherever he's hanging out these days. But he's just totally rolling his eyes like, I would have been the first guy learning about neuroscience, and I would have been the first guy learning about quantum physics. I mean, he spoke of things that should have now been proven out in physics, without having that mathematical language at the time. So
I would be very clear that I'm not knocking the statement going back to principle or people.
Oh no, not at all. I just said, like, I have a lot of. I really sometimes wish I had the strength of, I know this prayer will work today.
I think there is a need. Yes, there's a need to voice that. There's also a time and place to read the room and recognize that there's a rebellious nature among religious scientists and new thoughters that seeks to push the boundaries. And sometimes
it's kind of fun.
Yeah, it is. And I think it attracts all of us to it. And sometimes when we bump into disagreements, people want to go use phrases and, quote Ernest or go back to principle as a means of trying to win the discussion in that moment. But I think if we meant it to go back to spirit and to tap into the intuitive knowing of what's ultimately true, I agree with it 100%. Ultimately that, and that's the interesting dynamic about it is when we talk about faith and religions, that there's an aspect of them that are locked in to unchangeable truth, but their humanity is an evolving species. And this is something Wilbur actually pointed out in this book, if I can mention it for a moment.
Yeah, would you? I haven't read it. I probably should.
Yeah, but essentially,
it's probably not going to happen. So I probably should, but it's probably not going to happen.
I don't want to go into all of what he saw, but essentially, it was getting at that. Yes, there are common absolutes that are in that mysticism and the spiritual experiences are taking us into tasting and knowing truths at ultimate levels that are unchanging at the level of the absolute. But we also live in a relative world of changing and evolving natures where consciousness is evolving, and that human consciousness over time, from the early days of the major religions to where we are now, has continued to evolve, and it's continuing to evolve into the future. So we live simultaneously in two realms, in this absolute and in the relative. So we are in both the unchanging truth and we're in the changing. And one of the things that spiritual truths get to, sometimes they want to pit it against, well, which one's really true? Which one's really true? And they're both true.
Yes.
And so we have to recognize that there is an unchanging aspect to this spiritual universe, and there's a changing aspect to it, and that our human experience is moving through a changing, ever evolving aspect of it that's changing our faiths and philosophies and belief systems, but they all point to an unchanging absolute truth. And what we have to, when we can take a perspective that steps out and says both the unchanging aspect and the changing aspect is all involved in the one, that when we talk about non-duality, there is no dualness.
And they overlap, and they it's not like this.
Right.
I don't think. I feel like it's like this.
Yeah, every aspect of a hologram contains every aspect, which includes the aspects of the absolute and its unchanging nature. But it also contains that aspect of it that is spirit in motion, spirit in evolution, moving. And so we dually are living in an unchanging aspect and a changing aspect simultaneously. So when we go back to principle, we're going back and anchoring into the absolute to gain guidance about, but then we come back into the world of the relative and it's changing. So we can't stay in the absolute, because we also have to live in the world of the relative in our human experience.
Well, and our understanding of the absolute changes, and that's part of the process too. So yeah. I think we have so much more to talk about in the Are We Evolving? But I think we have to take a quick break. Do we not?
Oh, okay. Well, it's time to remind you that if you're enjoying this, to support the New Thought Media Network. It's a nonprofit that's supported through your contributions. And let's listen to this brief word.
We hope you're enjoying Conversations in Mind. This program is made possible by the New Thought Media Network, a nonprofit that's supporting conscious, spiritual media. If you'd like to support this work, just scan the QR code to make a donation. It lets the network know you like this show and helps them to continue bringing you this type of content. You can also go to ntmedia.org and click on Donate. Thank you for being part of the conversation. Now, back to the show.
Thank you. And again, we love your comments. That's where this conversations come from, and I'm finding this one interesting and fun. Well, I found them all fun. So are we evolving? That's the interesting thing. So as the thing is, like, to me, the New Thought movement is made up of people, right? Individuals. Right. And everyone that I know is evolving. Like, that's our nature. And most people are aware that they're evolving, and they're wanting to evolve, and they seek evolution. They seek it. So yes. And I think probably a lot of people feel like the structures around that are much slower to adopt and to change. And that's true. In any organizational design, the organization is always slower to change. It's a big ship. You have to get a lot of agreement. And in New Thought, particularly, I'm going to talk Centers for Spiritual Living, because I haven't been involved in Unity enough to really be speaking about how they make change. But for Centers for Spiritual Living, there's a lot of agreement that is sought, and a lot of thinking and thought and feeling and prayer or treatment that goes into any kind of, we're going to embrace this next thing. And always weighing it against, having to weigh it, unfortunately, against how, are people going to get upset about this? How many people are going to get upset? How much pushback will there be? How many people will embrace it? And we've been in this conversation around social justice issues for the last, number of years. I think we've finally gotten a lot clearer about that. And that is part of the evolution, not a recognition that treatment doesn't solve everything. That the thing was actually treat and move your feet. And so there needs to be inward work, and also then outward work. And I want to say too, like, I think that we are at a place where we could stop navel gazing, what I call it, quite so much, and start having a little more fun. Like, life is supposed to be joyful, right? And we talk about spiritual practice as work. And we talk about spiritual practice as this thing you got to take. Here's a list, take it on, blah, 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 this is supposed to be fun. Life is supposed to be joyful, you know? Yes, it can be stressful. Yes, there's all the things. And you can list all the things or not, you know? And I don't mean put your head in the sand and ignore real life. I mean balance it out. And don't forget to go ride a roller coaster once in a while or something, you know?
Well, yeah, I agree that we certainly can
Am
be.
I lecturing? Sorry.
You're preaching to the choir here, but
I know.
and I would agree with you that in the context of all humans evolving and all new thoughters evolving, that it's natural that we evolve. Not only are we individually doing it, and because we're individually doing that means we're collectively doing it. We're collectively moving through, and even beyond new thought, we're in a world that is evolving. So, and that impacts us because we teach that everything is connected. So there is this,
Yes.
so there is this growth and evolution that's being pushed along. So we're slowly moving like a blob into the future, like a snail moving on a timeline, and there's the cutting edge of our organization and the people within us who are at the very front, and there's the people at the back of that snail who are like, no, they don't want to change yet. So, well, like any organization or any kind of philosophy that's evolving, there's most of the people in the middle, okay to a degree with some change. There's those who want to push it further, and there's those who want to hold it back. But the overall arc and direction of new thought is moving forward into whatever forward looks like for us, and it's impacted by the society and the world in which we live, which obviously gets to the fact that the political craziness of the world that we've spoken about previously leads us to be more involved in looking at how do we speak to the social issues that are going on to the day, which has always been an issue, I think, within New Thought, always looking at.
Totally. If you go back into the old records, which I know you know more about the old records than I do. If you go back into the old records, there was a lot of this going on in the 50s and 60s too.
Right.
But you know what comes to mind is like there's these things, right? There's issues, there's politics, there's the social issues, there are things that are like things that we are figuring out how we want to talk about them and how we want to take a stand about them or whatever. But what I think our evolution is at this point, and what I keep hearing and seeing almost everywhere I go, is that there is a much bigger focus on spirit as love, on love as the way of being, on love as the driving, the understanding driving force behind all things, and then how do we as a species of humans come from a greater place of love in our decision making and in how we set things up in the world. And that is where I think we're really evolving. Like we've moved out of what was the capitalistic 50s and 60s version of New Thought / particularly Science of Mind, and into a place of how do we lovingly support a world that works? How do we lovingly support people in a greater understanding of truth and connection and oneness and wholeness and all those things we talk about, but we talk about it more from love. And we never anymore, I don't think anybody ever anymore says like, what in your consciousness created this terrible thing that's happening in your life?
Mm-hmm.
And that was actually a big shift. And personal responsibility is still a really big part of what we teach,
mm-hmm.
but we do it way more from love and with much more compassion than we used to.
Yeah, and I would add to that we're really talking not only the sense of love that we feel as a human being for others, but also love with a capital L, meaning that sense of the love energy that's embedded in the universe.
Yes.
So that we are, and everything we're talking about in terms of the evolution gets back to that wrap up of principle and the absolute spirit. We're all returning home in our evolutionary arc back to spirit and remembering it at a level that we didn't know. We had to go through this human experience to actually know our home better. But love is an evolutionary force, as Teilhard de Chardin said. Love is a force that is sort of, in my mind, I sometimes picture it like a tractor beam in Star Trek, where it's drawing me in back to spirit. So from the human level, we're feeling love to feel connectedness to one another. And in the doing of that, we're experiencing an interconnectedness through love. But we're also having this loving energy coming and pulling us back to spirit. So there's a love as at the human level, and there's a love at the spiritual level that's both serving our growth. And it gets back to the fact that the growth and evolution of New Thought or any faith is happening both on an internal level and on an external level. And the internal level, I think the external level often shows up in discussions regarding social activism. How can we be a force and a reminder and a conscience for what's possible for the human species? And so we want to push a message of unity and love, but at the same time, there's an inner aspect that where we're inner growing. And this is, I think, the part where people feel, and I see a direction in New Thought towards mysticism, towards inner knowing, inner feeling. And so we have both and I see it in a lot of our ministers too, that some of them have an emphasis. Many of our ministers have an emphasis in tasting the infinite in a mystical experience of a union with the one, and call us to those experiences. And there's others whose emphasis is on the social activism issues. But at the heart, if you speak to any of these, it's just where they're turning their attention, because they recognize that both feed each other, that both are part of the oneness. That where we're going and where we're evolving just naturally because of where we are on the planet right now is to be more socially active in the world, but to also be growing more innerly. So this whole, and I think we talked about it in some previous episodes about the move towards more of a mystical and inner awareness and non-dual nature in the teachings of New Thought. I see that aspect going hand in hand with and we're now also in the world trying to unite it and bring that oneness about in its expression and form.
So if we're going to talk about the evolution and the evolutionary arc, what comes to mind is like when the movement was new, we were coming out of Christianity in many ways. Mm-hmm. And so people still really held this idea of this God out there, the judging God, the whatever God out there. And so so now there's much fewer people. That did not come out right at all. But anyway, there are fewer and fewer people that come into our movement that have a belief already in that. And so they're already coming from a belief that is that there's a spiritual life that is internal and an energy that is external, but it is not like a God in the sky looking down and judging. And so I think the natural evolution of our movement has come from people coming into it more fully aware of who they are in their wholeness and in their well-being than even I did, 30 years ago. For how long? Oh my God, I won't say. Because so that has moved the movement into this place of mysticism and love and connection. Like everybody that grew up after Star Wars believes more in the Force than they do in this God. So I think that has helped us as a movement to evolve into this place of talking a lot more about what is the loving presence and how do we be the loving presence. And I think that's what the social justice things are all about, is how are we going to be the loving presence that moves these things in the world, or in the United States particularly, but, not in a, how do we fight it? How does it move into a loving place?
Right. We're all called to be a change agent in our own way.
Yes.
The power of love to guide us to the highest and greatest possibilities for the planet and for all of humanity.
And I see a lot more of those conversations happening now than even 5 years ago, and definitely more than 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we were talking about principle as an old form of principle, and now we're talking about love as guiding principle.
Yeah,
I think that's the circles I'm hanging out in. That's what's happening.
And I think what we're getting, I think that when we start getting into, a lot of times when you're looking at how religions have evolved, there's a lot of ecclesiastical changes where we did believe this and now we're going to believe this kind of stuff. I don't necessarily see major shifts in a New Thought. I see more of changes in its expression in the world.
Yes.
That the truths that we all attest to were actually built upon what, Aldous Huxley wrote about as the perennial philosophy, or Ernest Holmes came together with his combination of science, philosophy, and religion to bring forth science of mind. Most of New Thought, although they have different seeds from which many threads of it birthed, they all coalesced around certain concepts or ideas that people started realizing were common to the mystical teachings of all religions. And so what we are actually doing is moving along the perennial philosophy and a flavor of it down the pike of human consciousness and awareness, that we're shifting people to see it. But the truths aren't changing. The truths, we may be emphasizing more of them some. We may be, and I think where the growth of the truths comes is at the individual level. That I think people come into New Thought and they get attracted to certain aspects of the teaching initially that resonate with them. And then the more they stay, they recognize there's a depth to it. It's not all about, parking spaces and red cars.
Princess palaces and parking spaces.
Yeah. That there's a depth to New Thought that has a mystical aspect to it, that it really is pushing us to evolve not only in our own consciousness and awareness, but in our collective actions with the world of form, to move back into a higher aspect of expressing ourselves, changing the world for the better, but anchoring ourselves in that divine flow. And as we do that, as we grow in a depth of our awareness of the divine. That there's sort of like I'll speak for myself. A lot of it, when I came to it, was an intellectual understanding.
Yes.
And there's a degree of headiness that was fed by New Thought. So, I got it at an intellectual level, but it only it involves staying with the practices to take it to a deeper depth of feeling and understanding, of stepping out of Mark as an individual and recognizing Mark as a spiritual being, Mark is unified with one, which on one level can be sort of an intellectual game I can play, or it can be a greater experience of perspective that I'm developing. And I think that part of the movement is not so much in the philosophy changing, but that those aspects of us that are in it are not only changing with the world and all that's going on around us, but we're also changing in the depth of our understanding of the philosophy of the eternal truths themselves.
Yes. I'm just going to say yes there, because you got it. You really did. I mean, to simplify that, like, there is a movement in the world, and New Thought is part of that movement to this greater connection and awareness. And I'm going to call it love again. And because it's not just in New Thought, it's everywhere. I mean, it's there are pockets of the world right now that are not that. There are pockets of the United States that are not that. And I think I've come to believe they're in resistance to what is inevitable, is that we're all going to get there.
Right.
And resistance is futile. So.
Yeah, and it's as you alluded to earlier, the beginnings of most of the major religions came out of mystical teachings of certain prophets or individuals who had experiences and taught something that was an underlying truth of the unity of everything. Mm-hmm. And then it got dogmatic teachings added on to it, and for power and control within humans for many years. We could, that's a whole nother human story, but how the mystical teachings got co-opted for human purposes, which has led to it having a longer arc of development. But there's always been a mystical thread, or and for many times this has been the esoteric teachings. If you went into any kind of major religion, there was always the esoteric aspect, where if you were really somebody of depth and understanding, you would get the behind closed doors messages of the true teachings, the depth teachings. But if you came in just as somebody off the street looking for help with your everyday life, you got the exoteric or surface-based teachings of life. And so what we have, and I think to a degree, New Thought has that sort of surface.
Yeah.
To me, it's the materialist.
Palaces and parking spaces.
Yeah. But then there's
that's kind of the entry point. I mean, that's the quadrants, the 4 stages of conscious evolution, right? Consciousness evolution. first you got to figure out you can manage your own life. Then you can figure out that life has this whole other opening in it for something greater than material gain and greater than having the bigger house than the person next door. And that greater thing is this connection to some source energy, spirit / loving energy that knows itself as us.
Yeah. And I think for the major religions, there is a shift in the growth of their mystical side that we see, threads within Christianity, the Kabbalistic teachings within Judaism, the Sufism in Islam, etc. There is a growing development and awareness of the mystical sides that were the source of the teachings to begin with. And so there is a sort of a turning the dial up and down, up on the mystical side and down on the the
rules and dogma.
Rules and dogma. Yeah. And I think that we've never really, I think New Thought has never really hidden the mystical side. New Thought's always had it sort of front and center, but people take from it what they want from it. And sometimes they come in and they take the surface teachings and then leave. And they think that's what it's all about. And that's, one of my arguments for many years now is that there's a depth to it that I think many people don't recognize. And, if anything, that's why I put together that Asilomar book, because I thought it was really about Ernest Holmes' depth teachings that are at the root of stuff, where he gets to people who are really steeped in the philosophy and can talk to them at the mystical level. And whereas when he's talking to a general audience, most of Holmes' works were more surface nature, about there's a power for good in the universe. You can use it for, princes, parking spaces, and
But
whatever.
you know what, the thing, and we've talked about this a little bit before, it's really easy to talk about getting to those places from a place of time and money freedom. And for a lot of people, at the beginning, especially when the focus is really on those things, it's out of us. It's because they're in lack. And,
Right.
it's that whole thing of, you got to have a roof over your head and enough to eat and an ability to take care of your children before you can really, dive into, oh, I'm going to spend a half an hour a day meditating. Now, if we were doing that the other way around, things would reverse faster. And that's what people get. That's what people begin with is I can create a life that works for myself or my family out of these teachings. And then, yeah, sometimes that starts to feel dry and people think that's all there is. And there's so much more than that.
Right. To me, it's mindful of the whole thing of Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And
right.
And later in life, he sort of he categorized his needs levels and added a few levels in there. But what he essentially said was there's the sort of like the lower level needs below self-actualization and self-transcendence. Below those levels, all the way up through self-esteem, he called them deficiency needs. They were all driven by a sense of lack.
Yeah.
And that we had to fill the lack, and generally speaking, of those holes in our life before we could free ourselves to focus on the higher needs of self-actualization and self-transcendence. And so similarly, when somebody comes into New Thought and they're having a hole in their life, they're lacking in self-esteem, relationships, money, security, or whatever it is, they have to fill that first before they can feel comfortable enough and have the time and energy and human attention span to focus on the areas where maybe they're growth oriented. And Maslow called the higher levels being needs, capital BEING, recognizing it came from a transcendent nature, recognize that it came from a sense that we're full of our human self and are so full we're overflowing. So that the higher needs were really about giving back to the world in general through a sense of gratitude and overflowing for all the goodness that we already had filled up within us. So, but we had the key point, and I'm reiterating what you just said, was we had to fill those lower needs before we could feel comfortable moving into the areas of spiritual mysticism and things like that. That's going to be considered BS until I've got food on the table and my bills are paid.
Exactly. I mean, it's impossible to focus your mind if you're hungry. It's just not there. So, I want to make sure that I always want to, I guess I just always want to make sure that that we are expressing the fact that we both hold a great deal of compassion for people that are in that space, and the knowing that movement is possible and probable.
Right.
Um, so I don't
We
know that I have anything else to add.
No, I think that we're where we are generally in agreement. I hope this conversation's been helpful and answered the question. And again, we want to encourage folks to share your reaction to this and post any other questions that you've got. Be sure to support the New Thought Media Network.
Please. Yeah.
Yeah, and hopefully you get from this that we truly feel that New Thought in all its flavors is one of many philosophies that can assist a person in returning to their sense of wholeness and to using the power of love to not only grow their individual lives, but to move into that expansive nature.
I'll go with that. I'll just go with
Okay.
that. So yeah, thank you all for being here with us. We will see you next week.